You're listening to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and today I am joined by Jay Stringer, who is a therapist in Seattle and the author of a fantastic book called Unwanted: How Sexual Brokenness Reveals Our Way to Healing. Let me begin with a quote from the book. Jay writes, "I do not believe that sexual fantasies are something to condemn. Sexual arousal is one of the greatest gifts God has given to us, and we do not need to spend a lifetime annihilating it. There is another approach. It begins by listening to our lust." Jay Stringer. Today we are talking about how your story can help you understand your current sexual struggles. And before we dive in, remember that if you want to access episodes as soon as they are released, please download the Place We Find Ourselves app and support the podcast by paying $3 per month. If you don't want to pay the $3, the episode will become available for free 4 weeks later. Either way, please go to the App Store or the Google Play Store and download the Place We Find Ourselves app. Thank you for listening, and here is my interview with Jay Stringer. All right, welcome everyone. I'm joined today by Jay Stringer. Jay, it's good to see you.
Good to see you too, Adam.
Say a little bit about where you are geographically and what you're doing there.
Yeah, I live in Seattle, Washington, Pacific Northwest, and I am a therapist and ordained minister here in Seattle.
And you've also written a book, which I found incredibly meaningful, incredibly helpful, and we're going to spend most of our time talking about it. It's called Unwanted. But before we get into the book, can you share a little bit about just your own journey coming to find out about your story? When did you learn that you even had a story, and what prompted you to begin engaging it?
Sure. So, I remember being in Seattle, and someone just asked me about, like, I have, my first name is Jay. So often that gets is your name Jason? Is your name Jared? Is it short for something? And I just say, my name is Jay, Jay. And then someone asked me what my middle name was, and my middle name is Elmer. So like Elmer Fudd, Elmer Glue. And so I have both my grandfather's names. Jay was my dad's father's name, and Elmer was my mom's dad. And Jay died a couple years before I was born. So I was given his name. And then Elmer died when I was actually in grad school studying counseling psychology. And the sadness that I felt at Elmer's funeral was really that I just didn't know who he was. And so after that funeral, I was like, if I'm going to know anything significant about the life of a living grandparent, now is going to be the time to do it. And coincidentally, my dad's mom, Dorothy, was getting a little older, and she needed to move out to the Seattle area to be closer to my parents. So I was like, if I'm going to get to know Dorothy, I need to put in some serious effort, because Dorothy could just be like a cold steel door when it came to sharing any stories, any emotions. When she moved out here, I decided to go to an antique store to buy 3 skeleton keys from the era of her birth year. And on her 90th birthday, take her out to a cafe and give her this beautiful box. And I say, Grandma, these 3 keys symbolize 3 lunches that I want to take you out to learn more about your life and the Stringer family name. And I'm thinking, I just gave the best grandson gift ever. And she looked completely horrified. And she looked down at the keys, looked back up at me, and about 10 seconds later pushed the box back across the table at me and said, Jay, there are some doors you just don't open. There are some stories you just don't tell. And it was in that moment where so much of my life, my story, just kind of began to make sense of this is the inherited family system that I have been given. And we don't tell stories, we don't talk about them, and there are some doors that you just don't open. So that was really I would say the first time, mid-20s, early 20s, just really needing to grapple with the reality that I have a story, that I come from a generation that has a story. So that was really my entry point into, the stories that we don't want to tell have compounding ramifications for generations. And if I'm going to begin to change something of the Stringer commitment to hiding, I need to be part of that change.
Dorothy's words to you kind of evoked this fire inside of you to learn more.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So after she died, my parents started looking at some of the medical records from especially my dad's birth. And so my dad always grew up believing that he was the firstborn child to Dorothy. But in his medical records, there was actually a question that was asked, Dorothy, did you have any previous births? And that box was checked yes. And so for the life of my parents, they could not figure out who this was. And as they did a little more digging, investigation, what we've likely concluded is that she was probably raped by a family member sometime around the age of 13, 14 years old, and then shipped off to another state. So, I mean, just that the reality that there is trauma, there is sexual abuse, there's a lot of shame and hiding in my family system, and really needing to kind of understand that these personality traits that the Stringer family has, these struggles that we have are not random at all. They are a direct reflection of where we have been in life.
We're already really getting into what I think is one of the central points of your book, which is there is a relationship between our families of origin, our growing up years, even generations back. There's a relationship between that and our present day sexual struggles.
Nailed it. Yes, absolutely.
And you found that not only in your research, but through your clinical work, and you're even putting words to, you found it in your own life, and you found it in your own family. And so let's get into the book. But before we get into, I know I just kind of spoiled one of what I think is one of the theses of the book. I want to start with the preface or the introduction to the book. Let's start with this from the intro. You say, I don't believe, this was just so freeing to read. I do not believe that sexual fantasies are something to condemn. Sexual arousal is one of the greatest gifts God has given to us, and we do not need to spend a lifetime annihilating it. There is another approach. It begins by listening to our lust. So we're gonna unpack that because there's a lot in those few sentences. So let's just take it piece by piece. The beginning: sexual fantasies are not something to condemn. Why not?
Well, I mean, I think we have to begin with the notion that God designed, is the author and designer of our bodies. And so, I mean, when you look at just our genitals, the reality that the clitoris basically serves no other function except for sexual pleasure. When you get into just what our bodies are capable of, you see that there is play, there is eroticism, there is fantasy just in the design. So I think if you just even scale back a little bit from sexual fantasy, I mean, I think all of life has this component of fantasy. So if I think about, I mean, something like, if I'm going to eat spicy Indian food, I'm going to have a fantasy about some maybe sweeter Austrian Riesling that I'm going to pair with that Indian food. So that I'm entering into fantasy, I'm entering into imagination. And so when I think about sexual experiences with my wife, things that we have participated in from, months, years past, and then when I begin to anticipate sexual union with her in the future, my mind is in fantasy. It's in what's that giving and receiving going to be like between us. And so I think there's so many people that, especially if you grew up in Christian circles, all you learned about was food poisoning. Basically, don't do it. But we never taught people to imagine, to be able to learn how to cook. And I know I'm mixing metaphors right here, but we need the language to begin to talk about what we love sexually, what we want to experience. And so just the role of fantasy is always drawing us into a type of imagination for what could be.
Yeah, and your book begins, it continues, and it ends with this robust blessing of how God made both our bodies and our imaginations, our minds. We're created to imagine and to hope and to anticipate and to expect and to be disappointed when those expectations aren't met. But we're embodied sexual creatures, and we imagine, we fantasize about that realm of life, and it's a realm that God created.
Yeah, and therefore it is good.
And therefore it is good. And so right from the beginning, I mean, it's just so refreshing to read these sentences that I don't need to annihilate my sexual life, my sexual desires, my sexual fantasies. So why do we tend to try to annihilate it?
Yeah, desire draws us into danger, into risk, into trouble. So, I mean, I think it's so much easier in some ways to try to live without desire, because it's going to draw us into places that we are uncomfortable. So when I look back at, I mean, just a lot of the clients that would come in to see me, they had spent a lifetime trying to annihilate their desire. Anytime they had a sexual thought, anytime they had a sexual fantasy, they had deployed methods like slapping rubber bands around their wrist, trying to dart their eyes, bounce their eyes from anyone attractive. They got really kind of severe monitoring on their computers and their devices. And so it was that sense that if I have a sexual thought, if I have a sexual fantasy, I just need to squash it because it's going to ruin my integrity. And so I think to give a lot of people credit, I think we do want to have lives of integrity. But the problem is that when we try to annihilate our sexual life, there's just so much that goes with it. And so as one of my friend said to me in the last year, he said, Jay, when I've been having the same conversation with my accountability partner for 15 years, I know that annihilating it in accountability hasn't been beneficial. And so that was the turn in the book. And what I do far more in an online course called The Heart of Man Journey is to really invite people to listen to their lust. Because if we're not going to annihilate it, let me say it this way. I think part of what we're in culturally is, I would say, the religious right. A lot of the conservative circles are always trying to kind of do arousal management, just try and stop it, don't let it get out of hand. And then more the progressive liberal approach is kind of shame management, like shame is the ultimate problem. Let's just remove the shame and stigma associated with our sexual choices. And so you basically have two options, stuff it or just try and liberate it as if your sexual life has no meaning. So in my work, I'm really trying to carve out a middle path of let's not condemn, but let's not also give carte blanche to anything that we want to do. Let's try and investigate. Let's try and study. Let's try and understand what are the sexual behaviors that actually bring beauty, that bring rest, that bring glory to our lives, instead of just trying to squash it or liberate it.
Yeah. And so in the quote, the alternative to annihilating my sexual desire is listening, what you call listening to your lust. What do you mean by that? It's such a provocative and I think freeing phrase, and it's so succinct. And yet it's an invitation to something profound, which you spell out in the book. But even just now, put some language to it. What do you mean, listen to your lust?
What I do in the course is to kind of ask people to imagine their sexual life as a house. And so just to kind of be a little bit cliche, it's late in the evening and you hear that familiar knock of lust. Like you want to go to Instagram, you want to go to Tumblr, you want to go to your favorite porn site, or maybe some fantasy of someone in the office earlier that day. And I just kind of ask that question, what are you going to do? So in the past, you may have tried to annihilate that intruder. You try and shoot it. Some people call a friend for backup and say, I'm just really struggling tonight or this week. And then a lot of us just let that intruder kind of ransack our house. And so what I propose is, what if you went out onto the front porch and you met that lust, that fantasy, that desire on the front porch, and you just began to ask it questions like, why are you here? What is it about my house that makes you think that you would even be welcomed here? Or to even kind of say, you know what? You are a fantasy. You are a desire that has been with me since I was 14 years old. Why have you been showing up since, 1994? It probably wasn't a random house that you just showed up to. So I think if we can begin by asking questions and to be super curious about why our fantasies, why our pornography searches, why our sexual life came to be what it is, I think we're going to be in a place to have far more integrity, but also discover our story. And once we understand our story, then we can shape where we want it to go in the future. But if you're just trying to squash and annihilate something, you're basically trying to pull weeds for the rest of your life.
And like you said earlier, or like your friend pointed out to you, it just doesn't work. It doesn't work. And we all know this.
And why do we keep preaching it and teaching it? And yeah, it's maddening.
And so I love the imagery of inviting or welcoming our lusts as kind of a guest at the dinner table to learn from, to start a dialogue with the parts of our heart that are sexually desirous, and then just to begin asking questions and even noticing, like, how long has this particular fantasy been with me? When did it start? Has it served me? What's my relationship to the particularity? This is what I love about your book. You invite people to the particularity of our sexual desires and fantasies. And so here's another quote. And again, we're still in the introduction. Sexual failures, internet searches, and browser histories expose our sin, but far more, they are road maps. Sexual brokenness pinpoints the location of our past harm. So let's just, again, slow down and let's go slow and unpack this. You go on to invite the reader to pay attention to the words that we type into a browser when we're looking for pornography. The words matter. What we're searching for, you suggest, matters. It's not random. And you suggest what we're looking for can become a road map that takes us to the location of our past harm. So this is such a profound claim. Can you say more about it, unpack it a bit, Jay?
Yeah. Let me start by saying this. So I definitely not an expert in Lacanian psychoanalysis or Lacan, but one of the things that I read from Lacan early on was that he said that everybody has a symptom. So this is kind of where we get this notion that the symptom is the solution. So for Lacan, he would say that everybody has a symptom. And what he would say is that this symptom is a holy prophet that is saying the thing that cannot be acknowledged by the patient. Like, I think that's almost verbatim. And so what he would say is, like, if I have a bad back, my bad back is trying to get my attention, where it could be saying, hey, Jay, do you remember that car accident that you went through like 6 years ago that you jury-rigged a solution for? Like, now would be a good time to address that. But what we normally do is like, no, I'll take a gin and tonic. How about another 3 ibuprofens just to get through it? I think part of what we have to do in all of life, especially in our sexual life, is to begin to listen to our symptoms, to begin to listen to the things that we are troubled by, study the debris of our failure, of where we come from. And so I think when we can really begin to pay attention and see our symptoms, see our failures, see our struggles as holy prophets that are trying to get our attention, I think we will be in a radically different position to begin to listen to our lusts. So that notion of sexual fantasies are not random comes from research that I did on nearly 4,000 people. And so what I did was I asked probably somewhere around the range of 150 questions that got into your relationship with your mom and dad, formative experiences like childhood sexual abuse, bullying, other traumas, and then what were people dealing with in the present, from a lack of purpose to depression, anxiety. And then one of the unique signature features of the research was I began to ask people about the specifics of their porn searches. Put all that into basically an instrument and had a team at NYU do all the analysis for it. And that was basically what we kept seeing, is that the sexual fantasies that people have and the porn searches that they make could be shaped and predicted by the parts of their story that remained unaddressed.
So hold on. Say it again. Just say that sentence again.
The sexual fantasies that people had and the unique pornography searches that people made could be shaped and predicted by the parts of their story that remained unaddressed.
It's a stunning claim, and it's not a claim. It's a conclusion of your research. It's something that the data showed. And what you're saying is that the particular search phrases that I use, which are just a way of getting at what I'm wanting to see pornographically, can be linked to my family of origin harm.
Yeah. Yes. So let me give you a couple examples of this. So one example was that men who tended to look for younger people, college students, maybe that teen category of porn, a race that suggested to them some level of subservience, a smaller body type. If that was your porn search, you tended to have three things that were true. You had a very strict father. You had high levels of lack of purpose in your present life and high levels of shame. And so this is kind of where Richard Rohr would say that the pain that we do not transform, we transmit. Always someone else has to suffer because I don't know how to. And so what I'm trying to invite people into is these porn searches that you have could be driven by, a very authoritarian father who had a lot of control, a lot of domineering over you. And so that pain has to go somewhere. And so what ends up happening, especially in pornography, is that it gives you a place to regain something of that power. But then also for those people that are struggling with a lot of lack of purpose, don't know who they are, don't know where they want to go in life, porn gives them something immediate that they can have complete power and control over. And so that's that invitation of, a lot of you want to stop your sexual brokenness, but you haven't ever addressed your strict father. You haven't ever addressed your lack of purpose and how to confront and work through some of those difficulties as a man or a woman. And if you don't know how to do those things, then of course the symptom of pornography is just going to keep showing up in your life. We also found that a lot of women who had fantasies around infidelity and affairs, I can't remember, I don't have the research right in front of me, but it was something like they were 3 to 4 times more likely to report unmet needs in their relationships. And so, at least in my mind, I kind of go to the Enneagram 2, like the helpers, and just that shadow side of like, if part of the role of patriarchy is to kind of groom women to like not have a voice, not bring their desires to bear in the relationship. When those things get stuffed and you don't know how to bring your needs and aren't invited to bring your needs and desires to the relationship, that has to show up somewhere. So even that sense of a desire for infidelity doesn't necessarily mean that your marriage is over with or that you're sexually broken. It means that maybe you want more engagement, and maybe it's safer for you to engage that desire in fantasy. And I think that that's where the integrity piece comes in, is that what if you didn't outsource that desire for infidelity to someone else in your office, to someone else, in your church, but you actually, for men and women, grew more of a self to be able to kind of bring your desires to bear on the relationship. So that's that sense of even our brokenness has something to teach us when we are willing to pay attention to it.
Yeah. And one of the parts of your introduction, I'll just quote it: the formative experiences of our childhood are being repeated in our unwanted sexual behavior as adults. Sexual struggles reveal the truth of our stories in ways that will constantly surprise us. I mean, there's something that's just so hopeful, kind, invitational about shifting the paradigm from sexual desire is bad, perverse, and needs to be annihilated to this can be a clue to God's redemptive work in my heart as he's helping me get to know my own story. And that shifts the whole posture from one of what I would say is one of cursing to one of blessing.
Yeah.
Blessing not only my desire, but blessing that there is goodness even in, and this needs to be said carefully, but it needs to be said, even in some of my Fantasies for example, the example you were giving, infidelity. There's something underneath it that is actually good and glorious, and I'm not wanting to engage that. And so it's coming out sideways. Does that land with you? Would you add anything to that?
To kind of go a little bit more into my story, and maybe I'll start in kind of what I had to confront in the present and then go backwards. But some of my, specific search for terms that I would put into the internet had more to do with kind of a MILF category of porn. So this is like a mother-oriented themes where you look at, I think it's like somewhere in the top 10 porn searches across the world. Mother, stepmother, all these themes are so prevalent. And so both in the research and in my own story, I was really curious kind of what does that actually say about someone? And so a lot of what I had to do, especially when I was talking to my therapist about these specifics, was to go back to my own family of origin of where a lot of this began. And so my dad was a minister, was a Presbyterian minister. It would be a pretty regular occasion where someone would try to get a hold of my dad at the church office, and then they wouldn't be able to reach him there. So then they would call the home. We would rarely pick up our phone. And then we would hear on the answering machine just different crises that different people were in, from mental health to infidelity to just kind of difficulty with finances. And so I'm watching my dad attend to a lot of these meetings. Meanwhile, my mom is pretty disappointed, upset at times. And so my dad goes and attends to these crises, to a lot of the session meetings that he had to go to. And so that became part of my role in the family, was to kind of watch my mom's face, to be able to see where was she happy, where was she disappointed, and then position my life as this kind of good, caring son in the midst of all that. And so then when puberty hit, my style of relating with my mom, the way that I, was both kind of groomed, but also a lot of just my God-given gifts of being able to see heartache and see difficulty in people's lives, that confluence met. And then that became the fantasy of, a mom down the street being able to see me, care for me, but then also, a way of repeating that where I could see, in different marriages in my neighborhood and, even teachers at school, this kind of sense of, I can see where you are a very empty woman. I can see where your partner, your spouse, abdicates their emotional presence with you. And that's where I'm going to position myself in the fantasy. And so when I began to look at my own porn searches, when I began to kind of make sense of my own sexual fantasies, I was like, oh, there is such a reenactment of the way that I had learned how to be with my mom. And so I think this is the critical point, is that it's not just making that connection of, okay, I've now connected the dots, but it's to be able to say, this isn't something pathological. This is one of the greatest gifts that God has given me, is my eyes to see vulnerability and the human heart and suffering. And do I want to sabotage that through my own sexual fantasy, sexual brokenness and porn? Or can I be a man that can eventually learn how to protect that and not sabotage kind of my greatest strength? And so that was so much of the game-changing moment for me. Was, one, these sexual fantasies that I have are not random. I don't need to be condemned by them, but far more, how do I have integrity? How do I begin to allow my mind and my experiences with men and women to bear honor and integrity? And that just became so much easier than just trying to stop my lust. It became something like, this is a stunning thing that I have, and I want to protect that.
Yes. Yeah. And even the way you're telling your story right now, the vulnerability, there's a posture of kindness towards your own heart, even as you're talking. And this, I just want to touch on it before we continue. There's something about the book that prompted me to realize anew the kindness and the wildness of God. And the kindness in your voice now to yourself, I imagine, is very much derivative for how you have experienced the kindness of God towards your own story, your own struggles, etc. And here's what you say in the introduction: the voice of the Lord is never filled with accusation or frustration. And you're talking about it in the context of our sexual struggles. It's a sentence that I think most of us would kind of theologically agree with, but experientially, do we know that the voice of God, when it comes to our unwanted sexual behavior, you're saying is never filled with accusation or frustration? And then you continue, the God of the universe is neither surprised by nor ashamed of the sexual behavior we participate in. Instead, God understands it to be the very stage through which the work of redemption will be played out in our lives. And the story, the autobiographical story that you just shared, is an example of how you have experienced the redemption of God in the context of both your sexual heartache and your sexual fantasies.
Yeah, I mean, when I look at especially the Old Testament, especially in the book of Genesis, when you look at after Adam has just eaten of the fruit that God commanded him and Eve not to eat from, God doesn't come in and say, like, bounce your eyes from the next tempting piece of fruit. He says, like, where are you? What have you done? And then the example that I talk about in the book is Hagar, who's just been completely traumatized by the first family of our faith. Some scholars would say that she had a lot of cruelty done against her by Sarai. Some scholars would even say that she was sexually assaulted. And so what we know is that she leaves the first family to the desert or to the wilderness, where by all accounts she's going to die. And so it's there where the angel of the Lord appears to her and says, where do you come from and where are you going? And so I think that that's far more the voice of God, if we're hearing it, is this God who asks us questions, who invites us to curiosity, because he knows that in our honest wrestling with our story, we're going to come to see just how committed he is to our redemption. And so if you're hearing, like, you really freaking did it again, like, I thought you were over with this, look at you just, like, soiled your own marriage, like, that is not the voice of God. When we begin to kind of just listen to the voices that come up within us, we really need to be far more discerning of, is this a voice of contempt? Is this a voice that evil is kind of inviting us to believe, to merge with? Or is this something that is really coming from the voice of God? And I think the litmus test of that is, do you feel more curious? Are you surprised when you begin to think about that?
Okay, we are going to interrupt the conversation at this point, but in 2 weeks, we will have part 2 of my interview with Jay, the second half. If you want to dive into how your story is related to your sexuality, if you want to dive into that in more depth, check out Jay's course. He has a whole course on this at heartofmanjourney.com. That's heartofmanjourney.com. And also remember, if you want to access new podcast episodes as soon as they are released, please download the Place We Find Ourselves app. Thank you so much for listening.